$6. That is all it cost. Not 600, not 6,000, just $6 and one small piece of hardware that came in a plain brown bag from a parts counter. And when one mechanic bolted it onto a GM V8 that everyone in the shop had written off as slow, ordinary, and completely unraceable, something happened that nobody in that garage could explain. The engine woke up. Not a little, not marginally. It woke up like it had been sleeping for years and was suddenly angry about it. Quarter-mile times dropped. Throttle response sharpened. Power that had been sitting locked inside that engine, invisible and inaccessible, suddenly came flooding out. And the part responsible for all of it. A simple needle and seat kit for the Rochester Quadrajet carburetor. A carburetor that GM had been calling an economy unit for years, while hiding one of the greatest performance secrets in American V8 history right inside its design. If you want to know exactly how a $6 fix turned ordinary GM V8s into legitimate race monsters, hit subscribe right now and tap that bell icon, because this story is one of the most underrated in all of American automotive history. To understand why this $6 trick worked, you first need to understand what the Rochester Quadrajet actually was, and why almost nobody respected it. The Rochester Products Division was a General Motors subsidiary located in Rochester, New York. The division had been building carburetors for GM vehicles since 1949, starting with single and dual barrel units before moving into four-barrel territory. By the early 1960s, GM needed a new four-barrel carburetor that could serve an enormous range of engines across every single one of its divisions: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, all at once. The answer to that challenge arrived in 1965. The Rochester Quadrajet, designated the 4M series, was formally unveiled on the Chevrolet 396 cubic inch Mark IV V8 in the 1965 model year. From the very first moment anyone looked at it closely, the Quadrajet was unusual. It had an immediately recognizable feature that set it apart from every other four-barrel carburetor on the market at the time. The primary and secondary throttle bores were of radically different sizes. The two primary bores were tiny, almost comically small compared to a traditional square-bore Holley four-barrel. The two secondary bores were enormous by comparison, controlled by a large air valve that opened progressively as airflow demand increased. This spread bore design was not an accident. It was a deliberate engineering choice. The small primaries provided precise idle control and crisp, low-speed throttle response. The massive secondaries delivered the high speed flow needed for full power operation. On paper, it was a genuinely intelligent design. In reality, most mechanics looked at it and saw a problem waiting to happen. From the moment the Quadrajet arrived, the hot rodding community was skeptical. The nickname started almost immediately. Quadrajunk, Quadrabog, Rochester. These were not terms of affection. They were the names mechanics gave to a carburetor they did not trust, did not understand, and did not want on their performance builds. Part of the problem was the Quadrajet's reputation for bogging. When a driver pressed the throttle hard from low speed, the massive secondary bores could open too quickly, causing a lean stumble or hesitation before the engine caught up with the fuel demand. This hesitation felt like a bog. Part of the problem was also the float bowl. The Quadrajet had a smaller float bowl capacity than a traditional Holley four-barrel, which meant less fuel reserve under hard cornering or sustained high-speed operation. For all-out drag racing or circle track use, this was a real limitation. And part of the problem was simply that the Quadrajet looked wrong to anyone raised on Holley carburetors. The tiny primaries did not look like performance equipment. They looked like something designed for economy, not power. And that visual impression stuck in the minds of hot rodders for years. This is the same basic principle behind why a garden hose with a narrow nozzle shoots water further than one with a wide open end. The Quadrajet's tiny primaries were essentially creating a focused, high-velocity stream of air and fuel that the engine's cylinders could process more efficiently than the broader, slower-moving charge from a traditional square-bore carburetor. A carburetor with small primaries creates a high-velocity signal at low throttle openings. High velocity means better fuel atomization. Better atomization means more complete combustion. More complete combustion means more power. This is the same basic principle behind why a garden hose with a narrow nozzle shoots water further than one with a wide open end. The tiny primaries were essentially creating a focused, high-velocity stream. At full throttle, the large secondary bores opened, and the Quadrajet could flow 750 to 800 cubic feet of air per minute. Competitive with the performance carburetors from any manufacturer, the Quadrajet was not an economy carburetor pretending to be a performance unit. It was a genuine dual-purpose design, one that could deliver excellent fuel economy and throttle response on the street while still supporting serious power at full throttle. The problem was not the design. The problem was that most of the Quadrajets running around on GM V8s in the late 1960s and 1970s were not operating anywhere near their potential. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, GM V8 engines equipped with Quadrajets were suffering from a specific set of problems that mechanics were diagnosing incorrectly. Heat soak was a major issue. After the engine was shut off, residual heat caused the fuel inside the float bowl to partially evaporate, leaving behind varnish deposits that gummed up the needle and seat, the tiny valve that controls fuel level. A stuck or worn needle and seat meant the float bowl was not maintaining the correct fuel level. Too low, and the engine ran lean, losing power. Too high, and the engine flooded, also losing power and damaging cylinder walls. Additionally, the air valve spring controlling the secondary opening rate was often incorrectly set from the factory for the specific engine it was installed on. An air valve spring that was too stiff caused the secondary bores to open too slowly, robbing top-end power. A spring that was too light allowed the secondaries to open before the engine had enough velocity to use them, causing the bog that gave the Quadrajet its worst nicknames. These were the real causes of the Quadrajet's problems, and neither of them required a new carburetor to fix. They required a $6 needle and seat kit and a properly adjusted air valve spring. The man who did more than anyone else to prove what a properly sorted Quadrajet could do was John Lingenfelter. Lingenfelter was not a weekend hobbyist. He was one of the most respected drag racers and engine builders in American motorsport, eventually becoming famous for building some of the fastest street-legal cars ever tested by major automotive publications. In the early 1970s, Lingenfelter began campaigning superstock Chevrolets in NHRA drag racing. Superstock rules at the time required the use of original equipment manufacturer carburetors, meaning whatever carburetor came on the car from the factory. For most GM superstock competitors, that meant a Quadrajet. Rather than fighting the rules or seeking exceptions, Lingenfelter did something that changed how serious racers thought about the Quadrajet forever. He studied it. He learned exactly how the needle and seat affected fuel level. He understood how the air valve spring rate influenced secondary opening and top-end power. He experimented with the metering rods and jets that controlled fuel delivery across